one thing I love that he was talking about was kind of the not necessarily being all in on the draft to build the Eagles core, but talking about how he didn't want to create a logjam through free agency for the prospects that he takes with those top picks. The Eagles have right now the 15th overall pick, 16, 19, and the 51st overall pick in the second round. So it wasn't just that, free agents said no to the Eagles for why they only made a few moves. It's also because the draft was always going to be where they built this core. And I love hearing Roseman say that when you have the amount of high picks they do, that you don't want to block those prospects from playing. You don't want to create what he said was red shirt after red shirt after red shirt. Thank you. I am so glad he said this because so many people in media circles, with fans as well, this group think, general managers say it too, analysts, everybody, that, you never draft for need. You always take care of needs in free agency so you can take the best player available in the NFL draft. And while that is true to an extent, you don't want to fill every need in free agency, especially with Band-Aid signings. To me, that is as irresponsible as going all in on needs through the draft. You shouldn't ever force a need in the NFL draft. If you have a receiver that you really need, but he's 10 spots below a linebacker or a pass rusher or an offensive lineman, you don't reach and take that kind of player. Like a Marcus Smith back in 2014. You don't do that kind of strategy. Like that's not the mindset. But at the same time, you shouldn't do that in free agency either. Like I think that's, again, as irresponsible to throw a giant contract out there to a position of need because you don't know what's going to happen in the draft. Sometimes that can be just as worse, especially if the prospect pool in the draft that year at that position is deeper, more talented than the free agent pool. And by the way, it's cheaper. Like everybody says, don't waste draft picks on needs and don't force it because of how valuable draft picks are. Well, so is money. So is, salary cap space and contracts. I would rather, if I have a need, I hope I hit it through the draft compared to free agency, because then I've got that need taken care of on a cheap 4, sometimes 5-year contract, depending on if he's a first round pick or not, with 5th-year options. So again, you never force a need in the draft, but you don't do it through free agency either. I think you do draft for need in the NFL draft. You don't reach, but normally it's best player available based on the needs you have, both short-term and long-term. And then there's way more to it than that as well. I just hate when people have this black and white perspective of best player available. No, it's best player available based on the needs you have in short-term and long-term. Then you weigh the options of positions. What positions mean more. If we have a need on the offensive line compared to linebacker, offensive line a lot of time will take precedent, even if there's a linebacker higher on your board. And then the depth of the class too. Like if there's more linebackers deep and there's not as many linemen, we're more prone to take a lineman. There's just way more to it than this whole BPA philosophy that everybody just throws out there all the time. And quite frankly, I think it's lazy, and most NFL teams don't do it that way. Most teams don't reach for needs either. But again, the theme of this video is there's a middle ground with this kind of stuff, because people say all the time, like, free agency shouldn't impact your draft. If you signed, if you traded for Devontae Parker, that shouldn't impact if the Eagles take a wide receiver or not. And while that might be right, like if the Eagles signed Xavier Rhodes or Patrick Peterson to a 1-year contract, or Steven Nelson again to be the third corner with Darius Slay and Avonte Maddox, that shouldn't stop you from taking Kyer Elam in the first round, or Andrew Booth, or trading up, God forbid, for Ahmad Gardner from Cincinnati. So that shouldn't dictate things. But at the same time, if you sign a player or trade for a player that at a position you expect them to start at for multiple years, and you have other players at that same position in the same boat, you don't just draft high in the draft a best player available that happens to be at that position just because they're the best player on the board, and then create this logjam where somebody isn't playing and it's kind of a waste of those investments. That to me doesn't make any sense either. Like, you don't force a need, but you don't force BPA either. If I have 3 young, like at linebacker right now, Kazir White, the Eagles linebacker they just signed yesterday from LA, he's a 26-year-old player. And it's only a 1-year deal. And again, rentals normally, that's the part that free agency with rentals shouldn't dictate what you do in the draft. But when you have now a 26-year-old linebacker in Kazir White, who showed he had a career year last year, so did Davian Taylor, who you invested a third round pick in 2 years ago. That was seen as a high pick for him because you believed in his upside and he showed flashes last year. And the steps TJ Edwards took, I'm not saying don't take a linebacker in the first round, but that makes that like when they had a cornerback issue a couple years ago where they had Sidney Jones and Rasul Douglas and Avonte Maddox and Jalen Mills and Ronald Darby. When you have five guys, you're trying to find out who's part of your long-term future. I think even though none of that worked out for any of those players, taking a corner in the first round at that time, hindsight's 2020. Now it would have made sense. But back then, when you're trying to figure out what you have in a second round pick, a third round pick, another guy you traded a third round pick for, Avonte Maddox was a fourth round selection. I mean, when you have all of those players, you don't just go BPA if it's corner. So I'm really glad that Howie said, something like that and talking about how you don't want to create a log jam, kind of like what I'm laying out here, especially when you have picks in the first and second round. You have four of them. You shouldn't, you can redshirt one or two like Landon Dickerson last year before he had to play. But if you have four picks in the first two rounds and three of them have to be on the bench because you signed Derek Barnett back and you're forcing him on the field, or because, you brought in all these different players through free agency, that's to me, like, you want your rookies out there, especially when you're on the Eagles timeline where you're trying to go long-term. So I'm really, really glad he mentioned that because there's just so much of the same verbatim of, BPA, free agency shouldn't dictate what you do in the draft and deal with needs and free agency and not the draft. Like, no, that is just not true. There's a middle ground to both. You have to be controlled and disciplined through both avenues of talent acquisition.